Okay, well, I'm with Monica. We're going to talk about how to transition from law enforcement to corporate security. Monica, you started off in a couple of different law enforcement agencies before you made your transition. So let's just jump in and talk about what you learned, how you did it, what helped you, what hurt you in your transition, and get to it.
Sure thing. Yes, I was in law enforcement, and I was getting to a point where I knew I was going to have to make a transition. And trying to figure out what I was going to do was it really weighed heavily on me because I wasn't sure if there was really life after law enforcement.
Right.
I literally would stress myself out because I couldn't figure out what I was going to do. Um, I used to go on a lot of mission trips as well, and I met other retired law enforcement who also kind of were dabbling in the security industry. Um, and through those connections, I ended up getting an opportunity to do executive protection for a high net worth individual who was going on a book tour.
Hmm.
And the reason why I was basically asked for my resume for that position was one, because I was female and the client had specifically requested a female.
Hmm.
I spoke another language. They wanted somebody who was bilingual.
Good.
And they wanted somebody who had law enforcement or military experience. And so I checked all the boxes, and I had made these connections. So I was asked for my resume. I really wasn't sure what it was all about. I just knew it was security. I started looking into it, and I realized there's an entirely different sector out there that I had no idea about. And that's how I was introduced into executive protection.
I think a lot of people don't realize that companies have full security forces like a government agency would have, for law enforcement. That people do investigations and dispatching and global dispatching too, by the way, if you're in a big enough company. And same thing with executive protection. You maybe not on the scale of something like the Secret Service or the State Department, but there are businesses, high net worth people who want people around them or need people around them to help them stay safe. And you go all around the world doing
Yes,
protection.
exactly. I started doing executive protection, and it took me all over the world. And for 14 months, I was traveling on a private jet, something I never imagined. Um, Staying at five-star restaurants, but the task at hand was protecting my client. And although I honed in on a lot of my law enforcement skills, I really had to learn how to properly interact with professionals in the industry, and just the little nuances of maneuvering through not just being with a high net worth individual, but also dealing with their staff. So that's where the soft skills come in, and you start to realize that there's certain tolerance levels when it comes to the way that you communicate. Sometimes you can come across as being too aggressive.
Hmm.
So if you're lucky, you'll have somebody say, you're just a little too rigid. Maybe you can tone it down a little bit, you know? Or if you're in another part of the world and you need to be, more, have more of a command presence and you're being too soft, hopefully you're working with somebody that's saying, hey, step it up a little bit. But in my particular case, my very first EP detail, I was a solo agent.
Wow.
So I was new in the industry and I was alone. And I had to figure everything out on my own. So advances, I had to do them.
This
Google
is
Earth,
yours.
you Google everything that you can because that's all you got. And you have to learn how to properly communicate with them. You need them.
Yeah.
They're the ones that are going to give you a lot of information that you need because you don't necessarily have that advanced agent that can feed you all that information
You don't have the
and
resources of our
right,
government partners. Yeah, for sure.
exactly. And actually, one of the things that happened is I went into executive protection, and my client knew that I did not have that background, but I had the law
Hmm.
enforcement background. So they actually put me through an executive protection training.
Yeah.
Now, what was meant to be a week-long class was literally cut down to 3 days. So it was a crash course on the things that you should know. The the unfortunate part was that it was very law enforcement geared, so I already knew what they were teaching.
Hmm.
They weren't teaching me anything new. Um, so really, the training came as I went. So I was learning as you. When they first told me I was going to Mauritania, I had to look it up on the map because I did not know where that was. It's that kind of thing where you're like, oh, great, yeah, Mauritania, okay. Turn around, literally start
Google it.
looking it up. I have no idea, you know? So there's a lot of trial and error when you stumble into executive protection. And you learn really quickly that although you have your law enforcement experience, they don't want you to use it.
No, we were
They
just
want you to,
talking beforehand. Those
yeah,
hard skills that I can carry a gun because I'm Leosa, well, that's great in the United States, but to your point, when we start traveling abroad, we go down to South Central America, Europe. What are you going to do?
exactly. So I had to figure that stuff out. So I quickly learned that I had to contract people in country that could provide those other services that actually would allow me to really focus on my client.
Hmm.
And that's essentially how I ended up doing it. Um, so it's definitely a learning process. Everybody gets into executive protection differently. Some people realize it exists, they go through the training, they start networking, and then they start getting work. For me, it was just kind of a push into it. Okay, you're in the water, swim, and that's what I had to do. But in retrospect, I wouldn't change it, not at all, because it actually taught me a lot, and it also taught me how much I can actually do when under pressure. Because
And
when
when
you're
you're
under
alone.
pressure, you have to figure it out on your own, and you have to make sure that it's right. You have to make sure that it works, and that it makes sense because your client is still relying on you for their safety. So ultimately, that's still the main concern.
One of the things I like about what you were saying earlier, to kind of back up to the beginning of your story, you said that you did a mission and that's how you kind of started. And I think a lot of people don't realize, or they think that, oh, well, I'm going to retire from law enforcement and then I'm going to get a job in executive protection. I'm not going to go to any school because I know how to shoot and drive from when I was a cop. And they assume that there's a lot of parity there. And while there are some, I've always been an advocate of if you can learn through volunteerism, or through giving back to your community, go do that. There are a lot, maybe not in California, but certainly in the Southwest, in Texas and Arizona,
Right.
there are churches that have their own security teams that are in plain clothes, and because they can carry weapons, usually law enforcement officers too are involved. But and they go on missions, and they are looking for
Yeah.
security people to go with them and to help them stay safe. And because you know what bad guys look like necessarily,
Yeah.
what trouble looks like at least.
And,
And
and actually, that goes really well with what actually happened. I was on a mission trip in Guatemala.
mm,
I didn't get paid for that. The pastor came to me and said, "Hey, we would like for you to come with us. You'll be our protector and our translator
yep, perfect.
because I speak Spanish. And you won't have to pay for anything. Maybe a dinner here or there, but we'll take care of your accommodations and your airfare. What do you think?" Sure, no problem. So my payment was really just the trip, but that also allowed me the opportunity to connect with other people, some of which were in law enforcement, some of which who also did executive protection as a
Sure.
profession. And that's kind of how you start learning. And that was a great segue for me because I really didn't. I couldn't see myself doing 30 years in law enforcement, and I'll just be honest. I did it as long as I knew I wanted to, and when it no longer seemed like the right path for me, that's when I started to really start seriously thinking about something else. And the opportunity presented itself, so it was perfect timing for me. But yeah, churches do, help with that transition. Sometimes you don't realize it initially, but that's ultimately what you learn a lot.
Well, and having, those what people would say are soft skills, one being a female agents in the EP world, I think are ideal to blend. That's what you want to do as an EP, by the way. You want to blend in. You don't want to be standing out. Sure, you can be 6'5" and an MMA fighter, great, but you're going to stand out and you're going to draw attention to what you're trying to protect. Whereas
Yes.
I think people who can blend well and can look, similar to the culture of what you're trying to protect.
Right.
And then the added skill for you is of being able to be bilingual and being a Spanish speaker. And South and Central America are very natural. Of course, not everybody who in these countries speaks Spanish the same way. I think people should
Right.
understand that.
Different
But
dialects.
you're more successful than a person like me that doesn't speak another language is going to be. And I've worked protection all over the world. I just brought commodities with me, and I would pay people in like challenge coins or patches and things like that, and then they
Yeah.
wanted to work with me. So
Yeah.
whereas you can go right in and just speak the language, and they're going to be like, oh,
Exactly.
great, somebody
Yeah.
who understands. So I
And
think that's
I do sometimes get people who think that because I was in law enforcement, that when I go to hire EP, that I look for law enforcement. And I'm not
what do you
saying
look
no, I
for?
don't. Those
Okay.
skills are still good, but they're not the end all. I need to know more. I need to know what your how do you deal with certain situations when under pressure and yet still maintain your composure and deal with it in the best, most professional way possible. I had a young man who had just retired from law enforcement, and his first assignment was with me in El Salvador.
Hmm.
And so he had tattoos all over his arm.
Oh.
He had the crew cut. I mean,
Uh-huh.
he walks in, you can tell he's law enforcement. But what really made it, what was a huge disadvantage for him is wherever he went, he would stand and cross his arms.
Very approachable.
And he would stand by the door. And so I literally had to go up to him and say, listen, I don't know how much you know about El Salvador. There's certain gangs here, so you have to cover those tasks. Number one. Number two, if you don't speak Spanish, you stay close with me
Hmm.
or somebody that does. And number three, you're not in a nightclub. You're not a bouncer. Don't cross your arms and don't stand by the door. Blend in, just kind of let loose a little bit, still be on guard, which is, for some people it's a very difficult thing to do. It's very unnatural to be aware of your surrounding, have that situational awareness, and at the same time appear to be relaxed.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a balance in there that you have to master. And initially, when you just get out of law enforcement, if you don't have those skills, that's something that you need to establish. And that comes with practice. So I always tell people who are in law enforcement that want to transition into EP, practice with your family, practice at the mall. When you take your grandmother out, practice being her protector. If you make her nervous, imagine what you're doing to somebody who doesn't know.
That's right. Oh, those are great points. And I'll point out too that when it comes to whether you call it executive protection, close protection, those kinds of roles where we are protecting executives, business leaders, high net worth individuals who are usually also business leaders or people that may be kind of celebrities or have a celebrity status. That's different than what I'll say is like bodyguarding. And
Mm.
to your point, the bouncer, the guy that was a bouncer yesterday and is now quote unquote a bodyguard, those jobs don't pay the money that people made when they were in law enforcement. They pay a very low rate because there's nothing. They just want you to look big and mean,
Right.
like a bouncer in a club. But the people that will pay you a rate that you can be proud of and that you feel like you're getting what you are worth are those ones that require those softer skills or language skills, or you need to blend in because the executive doesn't want you to look like you're the security guy there. Right.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
So so let's talk more about something that you and I both, I think, agree on is that we're going to see a whole lot of folks coming out of the private sector or out of the public sector into the private sector, coming from law enforcement. You've talked a little bit about what you see as the skills that they need to have, and don't just go and go to 3 day school and now you think you're going to do executive protection. Go and really practice those skills and make people feel comfortable to be around you and make them feel safe. Those are the things that we want to do as protectors. But we've talked a little bit about, I can carry a gun and those kinds of things, which is great. But until you go overseas and you're doing protection. But one thing we talked about before we started recording was sometimes the licensing when you're working as a vendor for a security organization. A lot of people think, I can just go be executive protection anywhere, and that might be violating a security licensing in certain states in the U.S. and internationally. You have experience there. Let's dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah, so for example, with LEOSA, people think that because they have LEOSA, they should be good nationwide in the United States. And the reality is that's in the language of the actual bill for LEOSA, it actually states in there that it does not supersede the state laws.
State law.
So that means that you still have to have state licensing, and every state is a little bit different.
Right.
So if you're not licensed in a certain state, you really shouldn't be, doing security unless you actually have the proper licensing. And then going to overseas, there's also licensing. In Europe, you have to get licensing there, and you can get yourself in a lot of trouble if you don't have the proper licensing. So it's really important to, really truly understand the LEOSA, which is HR 218, and understand the state laws. And if you read it, I highly recommend you read it carefully and understand it. You'll see that there's probably more that you need in order to be able to carry legally in another state.
And your agency may prohibit that too. They may say, "Oh, you can't use LEOSA to make money."
Right.
Or you can't use your credential to make money. So really knowing what your agency requires too.
Yes, that's another excellent point. The agency themselves may not allow it because you're not in unofficial business. And the LEOSA really is when you're on official business. So it's a really gray line there. And if you can't. I highly recommend people just know your laws wherever it is that you're going. It's part of knowing what you're supposed to be doing anyway when you're knowing what the laws are, knowing what the like for COVID, what the mandates are in different states or even in different countries. Do they require the vaccine? The vaccine to enter the country. You may not need it here, and there's some states that may have outlawed the whole vaccine passport thing, but other countries are still requiring it. If you want to be in executive protection, you need to be able to travel internationally. So you have to have your passport. And nowadays, you're also going to have that vaccine card. So if you're opposed to the vaccine, you might need to think about another profession because, even though we don't know where this is going, one thing is for sure, other countries are requiring this card. So you're going to have to get vaccinated if you don't want to. You might have to rethink, what you're doing.
And they're, South and Central America have been hammered by the pandemic. And as open as their borders are, similar to Europe, when the EU came out, all the border guards went away essentially and went to ports of entry. And so you can drive from Germany to Austria to, to Italy, whatever. And so, but with the pandemic, that's really changed how people travel internationally. Not just, oh, well, you got to do temperature checkers, you got to wear a mask and all that stuff. Sure, you got to do that. But, to your point, a lot of what we do in executive protection is travel security and travel awareness. So where do you think, pandemic aside, I think that's really changed the way we travel internationally, but where else are we going to see changes? Because one thing I think the pandemic has made us very aware of is we're vulnerable as a society, and we don't have everything that we need as our companies are not as resilient as they should be. So how is that going to change travel security, executive protection, global security operations centers? How the economy has been over the last year and a half going to affect the future of this kind of industry?
It's evolving. It's very fluid and it's evolving. I think that with the hit of the pandemic, a lot of executive protection companies saw a big change in their travel teams because some companies have a travel team that does the advances, or they'll have a team that is kind of a rover team to kind of, give some people a break and then, they're off again. So they had to scale down their teams. Plus there was no travel, so
Right.
it really put a big, it suffered just as much as restaurants and other industries. How it's changed, I think that what we're going to see is there's going to be more of a need for executive protection.
Interesting.
And I think companies are becoming more accepting of their executive protection teams and that portion of the security, because everything is budgeted, and there's a budget that goes to security and certain amounts is allocated for each section of security. You have your GSOC, you have your physical security, you have your cybersecurity, you have your EP, and then you have global event security. So everyone gets money allocated to them. I think what we're starting to see is people are starting to value executive protection a little bit more, understanding it, and also I don't think it's so. I think it's kind of a symptom of the pandemic because of some of the crime that has come from that. People were tired of being locked up in their homes. They became anxious, and now we're starting to see kind of a rise in crime. And with that is a rise in security. They kind of go in hand. So I think that we're going to see a lot more companies actually going towards an executive protection team, even if it's one or two, if they didn't have one before, because they're starting to see more of a value in having that. Plus the other thing that some people don't understand is executive protection isn't just physically protecting the client. It's also protecting the company. It's protecting the CEO or any of the C-suites reputation, protecting against kidnapping. So there's a lot more to it than just traveling with your agent or with your client and making sure that he's safe. So there's a lot more to it than just being physically there, present, social, situational awareness, and that you have your eye on the target. So I think going to the classes, the executive protection classes, does give you a little bit of benefit because you learn some of those aspects that you probably wouldn't know if you just try to come right into it from law enforcement or from the military, because you just don't know. You don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah.
So if you think that you had your shoe in, you may not. And it also depends on the client.
And you haven't developed those soft skills necessarily, or the cultural skills of the organization that you're going to be part of, because to your point about contract versus in-house, if you're working in a contract role, your client may change with some frequency, and so you kind of have to be a chameleon and figure out, okay, where are we going, who are we going with, how are we going to do this, and how do they, a high net worth individual may travel differently than a CEO of a company. Their brand is potentially different, especially if the high net worth individual is retired or no longer involved in being the face of a company, let's say. So those are all distinct differences.
Exactly. Now I'm going to excuse myself for one moment. I have to plug my computer in. I've actually
No problem. That's okay. No, this is good because we do this live, guys. We don't change anything here. But I think this is what we've been talking about is really important so that people understand that it's not, you don't just flip a switch, right? There are things that you got to go through, that you have to do to get to a level where you're able to be greater value to an organization that does executive protection. We've been talking a lot about, but to kind of, as we're kind of coming up on our 20 minutes, something that we talked about early on was the value of having women in this industry, because they see things differently than a male will, and they can blend differently. They bring different skills. What advice would you give women who are interested in executive protection, or maybe they don't know anything about it? How do they get interested? How can they find out more information? And then how do they successfully transition? And then how do they stay successful in the industry?
Right. So, having been kind of thrown into the industry, and like I said, I wouldn't change anything about it. But if I have new women women that want to come into executive protection with law enforcement or military experience, I would highly recommend that they go to a class.
Okay.
And there's several companies throughout the United States that, offer classes. It depends on what your pocketbook can actually manage, because they can be pretty expensive. Some of them do have scholarships. So if you don't have the money to pay for it, inquire about a scholarship and see if they can offset some of that cost. But it's a good way not only to get started and kind of familiarize yourself with the industry and some of its some of the things that you're going to need to know aside from shooting and driving.
Yes.
You can network, and to me that's the biggest value. Networking. Find people on LinkedIn that are in executive protection and connect with them. Find people on Facebook. There's Facebook groups that are dedicated simply to either security or executive protection. Join those groups and start networking, and that's how you can start really getting to know some of the people in the industry and also get pointers from other people who have actually been doing this for a while. And I think that's going to be the biggest thing. So networking, and networking. And also, jot down all of your skill sets, hard and soft. Write them all down and take a look at some job postings for executive protection. And take a look at what their requirements are and just kind of match what your skill sets are with their requirements. Then tailor your resume to meet that job posting so that you have a better chance at getting that particular post or your position or get on that detail. That is something that I don't think they teach as much but how you compose your resume, how do you market yourself? One of the other things I tell people is if you don't have a LinkedIn profile, you need to establish one. It is such a great way to get your name out there. Put as much as you can from your resume in there, and just kind of show who you are. This is a really great way for you to showcase your skills and your personality, and I think that is also another way to get into executive protection by tailoring your resume and getting a LinkedIn profile.
I think you nailed it too with networking. I think that's so huge, and what we try to do here with this, with you telling your story and getting this word out to other people who might be in a similar circumstance that are interested in doing these things. I always say, don't go it alone. Network, get out there, talk to people. You need to figure out what you want to do. What I always say, I still don't know what I would do when I grow up. That's still true for me. But every person you talk to, you learn something from, and every experience you have are good. Even if it was a bad experience, you still learn something. That's a good experience.
Yeah.
And I think, going out and doing these things, especially if people are interested in executive protection, because people don't generally get hired on to be in a close protection role unless they are known, are trusted, and people have seen how you will respond to react to challenging circumstances.
And the best way to do that is through networking, getting people to really get to know you. And one other thing that I think is important is understanding which aspect of protection you want to get into. Do you want to protect entertainers? Do you want to go into corporate executive protection? High net worth individuals, royal families from the Middle East? Which one is what you want? I've done all of them, and I was able to narrow down that I really fit best in corporate, in the corporate side. So yeah. So then I started to really focus on getting in with a corporate, corporate security position, and that's kind of how I started expanding my knowledge in corporate security. And what's great is they also have executive protection, and that's what I'm good at. So I started to target those companies, and so that was for me. For some people, it may be celebrities, and if you really enjoy going with a celebrity, then look for job postings for executive protection for celebrities.
Yeah. And by the way, you got to move to LA.
Read books. There's audiobooks, there's books on executive protection. Take a class, networking, LinkedIn profile. Those are all going to be extremely important. And then also carrying your resume to a particular job posting.
And by the way, you all folks that do this full time, that's a hustle. You are on your feet for 12 to 20 hours a day. Yes. You're up before the protectee's up or the boss is up. You're cleaning cars, which, by the way, is maybe not something in an EP job description. But I worked a detail recently, and when the limo pulled up, the executive had spilled something. And so the driver was like, we got to get this cleaned up. We got the protectee inside safe with other agents. And then I went and grabbed a vacuum for the driver so that he could clean the car. Right. Yeah. And I mean, that's not part of your job description, but it is.
So we are, in a way, in the hospitality business.
Totally agree. 100%.
Because if the client spills something on themselves, you may have to go to the store to buy them a new suit, jacket, or a new shirt, or they may want something dropped off at the dry cleaners before they head out somewhere else, and they ask you to take care of it right away because it's a very expensive suit, and they'll only trust you with that. So we have to do basically anything that they request us to do. But if it is simple to do so, we do it.
But that's a great point, because if we didn't do it, to your point, expensive item, we're still doing protecting assets.
Yes.
And then the protectee is not going to be the one going into the dry cleaner, and they're now exposed to whatever it is that maybe is involved with that
Right.
event. So
Exactly.
I totally agree with you. Hospitality is, but being open to that and being at least understanding of like, okay, is this something that will help keep the protectee, and I'll use Brian Jansen saying, safe, happy, and productive, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
Jansen and Christian West put that together, right, in their book.
And
But
it's true because our job is to focus on everything else that's happening around our client
yeah,
so that our client can focus on what they're good at.
that's it. That's it. Great
That way they
point.
don't have to worry about their safety. That's what they hire us for. And then one other thing too that is extremely important, because I know executive protection, being a bodyguard, close protection is extremely, um, people think that it's this glamorous
Right.
job that you're doing. I'm not gonna lie, it is pretty fun, and I love the travel and some of the perks that come with it. But one of the things that people need to understand, if they're going to go into this business, your time is no longer your
Uh-uh.
time.
Nope.
You don't have time. Your time is the client's time. If the client takes a break, you take a break. If the client is go go go, you're going to be go go go. So self-care is going to be extremely important when you can get it in. You sleep when you can, you eat when you can, and definitely you're going to need to massage your feet a lot.
Yes. I have, we were talking about flying on private jets, and after you do that, you're like, why would I even fly any other way? Because it's so nice. But I've eaten in the back of lots of five-star restaurants. I've stayed in the servant quarters and in private homes, and you just yeah, you're around kind of this opulent lifestyle, but you don't lose sight of the fact that this is not who we are. We are not that
Right.
person. That's for the executive. If the executive invites you to eat dinner with them, you got to be kind of more guarded with those opportunities, or but that's not for you. That's for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
They
Exactly.
have earned it for whatever reason. Well, Monica, this has been a great conversation. Definitely appreciate you highlighting a lot of the skills that a lot of people don't always talk about. We didn't even get into medical skills. Having those are even more
Yeah,
important too.
actually, that's I also do a clubhouse for women in protection, and one of the things that
Shout
I
it out. What's it called?
yes, Mondays at 7 p.m.
All right.
Eastern, Women in Protection on Clubhouse. It's Monica, myself, Monica, and Monica Cuoto, who is a 6-degree black belt. She has her own dojo, but she's also in executive protection
Awesome.
in Portugal. So we cover both sides of the world.
Love
But
it.
one of the things that I also say is, and I just lost my frame of thought. What were we talking about?
Medical.
Medical. If you have any kind of medical first responder, have a first aid kit. What to have in your first aid kit. But this is kind of also a shout out to all of those firemen, EMTs, nurses
Definitely.
that want to transition into another career. This may be something for you if you understand all of the other nuances that are required. We could use more, intelligence
100% agree.
analysts,
Yep.
cybersecurity. Those are all aspects of the industry that we don't necessarily talk about, but it's definitely part of what we do.
Yeah, keeping the executives or the high net worth person safe, happy, and productive it takes an army sometimes. And Mark Zuckerberg has a detail that's quite large for a reason. There are people that really want to do him harm, so the approaches though are not the Secret Service approach. That Secret Service approach works for foreign dignitaries, for heads of state, stuff like that. The way we
It
do it
is,
in the corporate
it's
world.
it is actually good to understand how they work and
Yeah,
why they do the things that they do, because that'll help you as an individual to kind of mold what's comfortable for you and
right.
come up with your own method of protecting. So if we understand why certain, the CIA does or the Secret Service does how they do it, we can do better on our end as well. Even though we're on a much smaller
Very true.
scale, it's still effective. So it's good to understand how other people also work.
Especially if you have to work with them. I've had plenty of protectees get kidnapped by a head of state of the United States, and get launched into their motorcade. And if you don't understand how the Secret Service is going to do what they're going to do, you got to be careful and not get involved, or get involved when at the right time, when it's
Yes.
safe to do so, because they don't mess around.
No,
They
they
don't care who
do.
you are. What agency
They
you
do
belong to, or
not.
I've had plenty of my admirals and generals get picked up by POTUS and get included in their motorcade, and we're like, wait, but how do we now? Okay, we got to figure it
Yeah.
out. So just
Yeah, it
knowing
is.
that is good. Yeah, I totally agree. Monica, again, thank you so much. It's been great. You make sure, for the folks following along, you connect with Monica on LinkedIn, follow her on Clubhouse, join her Monday evening talk. I think this is how we communicate now in 2021, and this is how we learn. This is how I learn. So, Monica, I appreciate you being on and covering something that both you and I are passionate about, and trying to understand, and how we evolve this, and how we keep change going in a positive way.
Yes.
So thank you for being here. Make sure people are liking, subscribing, commenting below. Monica will be linked below as well. And I appreciate everybody, what you're doing, what you're going through. But you don't have to go it alone. Folks like Monica and I are here to help you. So thanks, Monica, again.
Absolutely. Thank
Appreciate it.
you.
Great
Thank you
discussion.
for having me.